Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining State of Roseville Water. My name is Maurice Cheney, and I'm with the City of Roseville Environmental Utilities, and we are your provider for water, wastewater, and trash and recycling services. But tonight we're focusing on water supply and water resources. And if you joined us last year, you knew what this was about. And for anyone else, we're here to give you an update on the city's current water supply and share planning efforts and upcoming projects aimed at providing consistent and reliable water resources. And so before we begin the official presentation, there's just a few housekeeping items. If we can advance the slide. We have you on mute, not because we don't want to hear from you, but just to reduce any distractions or interruptions. And we are recording it. You may have seen and noticed that we are recording it. We intend to place this on our City of Roseville YouTube page and also our website, which is roseville.ca.us/EU. And if you have any questions during this meeting, you can use the chat feature, and at the end, we'll answer any questions. And if there's anything clarifying during the presentation, we'll be sure to answer those questions as well. And if we don't get to yours, don't worry. We're going to collect all the questions and post them along with the answers with this video recording. And so with that, I want to introduce the speakers. We have three gentlemen tonight. Our Assistant Director, Sean Bigley, and then our Water Utility Manager, George Hansen. And then finally, we have our Water Conservation Administrator, Bobby Alvarez. All three will present on different portions of the agenda and help answer questions you might have. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sean.
Well, good evening, everybody. Again, I'm Sean Bigley. I'm an assistant director. I have oversight over the city's water utility as well as the city's wastewater utility, and really happy to be here tonight to do our second annual State of the Water presentation. And so hopefully you'll find the discussion informational, and certainly we're here to make sure that you have a good sort of basis of how our water system works and where our supplies come from. So really looking forward to tonight. And with that, let's move on to the next slide, please. All right, so just a little bit about the agenda. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about just our how we actually develop rates and how that kind of looks with respect to the service we provide in terms of the quality and value of that service relative to the cost. We'll also go over our current water supplies, just a quick overview of those. We'll also talk about our current water supply conditions during this current water year. We'll also discuss anticipated impacts of climate change based on some studies that were done a couple years ago working with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And then specifically, what are some of the things that the City of Roseville is doing to both adapt and prepare for climate change impacts in the future? And then with that, we'll end with any Q&A. So with that, we'll go ahead and advance the slide here, please. All right, so a little bit about our services and our rate structure. So based on council expectation policy, we evaluate utility rates every 2 years. And that's for the span of utilities that are covered by environmental utilities, which there's the water utility, the wastewater utility, and we have a waste services utility. And during that rate process, what we do is we evaluate or look out on a 10-year basis to really determine what are some of the things that we should be considering in terms of impacts of inflation, costs of materials, labor costs, a whole variety of different components that really drive our costs, and then looking at what we would project relative to revenue, and then doing a really detailed analysis that provides recommendations in terms of what the city should entertain in terms of a potential adjustment to those rates. And really, just to kind of point out our overarching financial approach, and this has been a longstanding approach within the City of Roseville, which I think sets the city apart from many of our neighbors within the region and the state. First is that council and leadership is for many years has been proactively funding rehabilitation costs via rates, and so we really operate on a pay-as-we-go system. We do that because not only does it allow us to be able to deal with emergency situations where you have sufficient cash to deal with those situations, but also in terms of the borrowing climate, borrowing to pay for rehabilitation costs can be quite expensive. And if you can imagine, even currently with what we see sort of in the market with respect to interest rates, having a fund available to be able to proactively rehabilitate our water infrastructure is really important. And I think it also adds a tremendous amount of value to the service level that we provide to our customers in Roseville. Also worth noting is Roseville is among the lowest water utility rates in the region, but yet we also see it as providing a high level of service with that lower utility rate. And so the bottom line is, we like to tell folks, is that we really feel like we provide a really good value, if not excellent value, for our customers for the dollar spent. And then finally, I'll just note, if you can go back one more point. One more point, just to reiterate this, is we recently underwent a review by Standard & Poor's regarding the water utilities financial position, and in their conclusion, they actually upgraded the bond rating for the water utility from AA to AA+. So I think that's significant and worth noting. Next slide, please. All right, just a quick overview of our current water supplies. So we have, in terms of surface water supplies, several sources. First is our Central Valley Project surface water supply, which is about 32,000 acre-feet of water. Acre-foot of water, essentially what that is, if you can imagine a football field, the internal portion of that football field, not the end zones, covered with a foot of water. And that amount roughly serves about 3 households worth of water for an entire year. So the Central Valley Project is actually a federal project. It's managed by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. This 32,000 acre-feet of water is actually supplied through Folsom Reservoir through an intake at the dam. In addition, we have a water contract with Placer County Water Agency through their Middle Fork project, which is a project that was put in place in the 1960s. And we have access to 34,000 acre-feet of water from the Middle Fork project. And then most recently, we were able to negotiate with Placer County Water Agency options for an additional 10,000 acre-feet of water for future needs down the road. So total surface water supply is 76,000 acre-feet of water on an annual basis. And then in addition, we have 7 aquifer storage and recovery groundwater wells, and with more ASR wells planned or currently under construction. And ASR wells essentially have the ability to extract water like a traditional groundwater well, but also has the ability to actually proactively recharge water into the surface water into the groundwater basin. And so that's a significant part of our ability to be able to have a diverse water supply in Roseville. Next slide. All right, in terms of the Central Valley water supply, this was actually the CVP, or Folsom Reservoir. It was authorized by Congress in 1944. CVP was authorized by Congress in 1944. It's an integrated system of reservoirs, canals, and other infrastructure. Folsom Reservoir construction began in October of 1948. And it was completed in 1956. Again, this Folsom Reservoir is solely operated by the Bureau of Reclamation, but it's also operated in conjunction with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Folsom Reservoir, for folks' education, is the primary purpose of that reservoir is for flood control. Water supply is actually secondary to that reservoir. So since 1971, Roseville has had access to our CVP surface water supply, again, 32,000 acre-feet. That surface water supply is actually subject to cutbacks during dry or drought years, and that's per the contract, and that's actually per the federal policy as part of that contract. Next slide, please. A little bit about Middle Fork project in Placer County via Placer County Water Agency. So again, that project was outlined in 1960. 1961, Placer County voters, including voters in Roseville, approved $140 million in revenue bonds for the project. Construction of the Middle Fork project was actually completed in 1967. It also consists of a system of reservoirs, canals, and other infrastructure. That project in total actually has about 342,000 acre feet of total storage. And again, for surface water purposes for the city of Roseville, we have access to about 44,000 acre feet of that. This is used, has been in the past used primarily for backup surface water supply, but eventually this water supply will actually be the supply used for total build out of the city a few decades from now. So next slide, please. In terms of just the current water supplies with respect to our ASR wells, that development of that system and actually development of the permitting started in the early 2000s. Again, it has the ability to both extract water like a traditional well, but we can also store water via recharge, direct recharge through those same wells. We currently have 7 wells in the system. We'll have 2 more online in 2025 and the last 2 in 2027. And primarily these wells are used as backup for supply cuts during droughts and emergencies. Next slide, please. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition over to Bobby Alvarez. Bobby.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bobby Alvarez, and I'm the Water Conservation Administrator for Environmental Utilities here at the City of Roseville. If you can move up one slide. I'm sorry, I think there's one more. Okay. Thank you. Tonight I'm going to cover the lake conditions, but first I'll cover I think these might be a little bit out of order, Maurice, but I wanted to also cover precipitation and snowpack that we had this past season, which allowed for such a great water supply. Tonight, I also touch a bit on the California water use legislation and some water reduction tracking. So with Folsom Lake, we're at 78% capacity and 135% of historical average. Go ahead, next slide, please. This is what the dark blue line is, how the water flowed in out of Folsom Lake. But as Sean mentioned earlier, the primary purpose of Folsom Lake is flood control. So it's pretty difficult to manage this lake. And they were in preparation for the great snowpack that we had. So they wanted to make sure that it didn't exceed its capacity. Next slide. Because we are an integrated system, as mentioned earlier, we also keep a close eye on Shasta Lake. Shasta is the largest lake in California. It's over 4 times the size of Folsom Lake. And as you can see, currently it's at 79% capacity and 128% of historical average. Next slide. Can you go up one, please? Sorry, I think you skipped over one. There you go. And here again, the dark blue line, way above average. I think the highest I've seen Shasta was at 99%, and the gradual releases. Thank you. Next slide. Here's just a comparison on the right. These are current lake conditions in California. And just 1 year ago, this was the picture we were looking at. Most of the lakes were just pretty low and pretty dry. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about Folsom Reservoir. The lake's elevation's at 466 feet, and it holds about 1 million square acre feet of storage. The water supply intake, which is the dark black line on the right, is at 317 feet, but it's important to note that we cannot operate this pump because of daylight So, but right now the lake is at 445 feet. Currently, the flows that are going into Folsom Lake are at close to 3,000 cubic feet per second, and the releases are at 4,000 cubic feet per second. Next slide. So here, this is the water use efficiency legislation of California, Senate Bill 606 and Assembly Bill 1668. This is a long-term standard for efficient water use in California. There are 4 components to this standard. It's in residential indoor water use, residential outdoor water use, water loss, and commercial landscape irrigation. To date, we only have 2 standards that are established. It's the indoor water use and the water loss. What I want to mention also is that all of these together, it is an aggregate of all 4. So we are shifting to a budget base as opposed to a percentage base. And so right now, without the residential outdoor use, it's hard to tell how the residential piece is going. But for water loss, if you want to shift to the next slide, please. So our water loss standard is 22.7 gallons per meter per day. And as you can see, we are way below that standard. It's important to be below and be diligent about making all of our efforts to try to reduce our water loss, so that if we happen to, once our budget is established, if we happen to be over in one of the areas, then it's good to be less than others, because again, it is an aggregate of all 4 areas. Next slide, please. So when we had the drought of 2015, we used the 2013 data as pretty much a normal water use year. The water use efficiency was not as prevalent as it is today. So these are all production numbers. As you can see on the graph on the spreadsheet on the left, in 2013, production of water that was treated was over 34,000 acre feet, but our actual in 2022 was over 29,000 acre feet. So that was a reduction of greater than 13%, which is great. On the graph, on the spreadsheet to the right, where we stand today, we're tracking cumulative savings of 19% less than we actually used in 2013 for this same period. Now, what's really important to note here is that today our population is almost 30,000 more than it was in 2013. So not only is our population growing, but we're actually consistently using less water. Next slide, please. It's another view of what I just spoke about, but just in gallon per capita daily. If you look on your far left, in 2008, we had a little over 100,000 people in the city of Roseville, but our gallon per capita was at 290. Then you shift towards the middle. When we had the drought of 2015, our gallon per capita was at the lowest it ever was. But remember, this was a time when everybody made a concerted effort to reduce water. Lawns were turning brown. So that was during that drought. And then you shift over to 2020, which, as we all know, was the pandemic, and everybody was working from home and was using a lot of water, but we're starting to trickle back down. And I anticipate that we'll be close to this same number when we get the final numbers for 2023. Next slide, please. I think that's it for me. Yep. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bobby. So my name is George Hansen. and I will be covering the rest of the presentation. So we'll switch gears now and discuss how the impacts from climate change has introduced some level of uncertainty regarding long-term water supply reliability for the American River Basin. This was actually the focus of a study that was published summer of last year, the American River Basin Study. It was a joint effort between multiple local water agencies, Roseville being one of those agencies, and in coordination with the Bureau of Reclamation. So the study discussed future climate and hydrology projections and also identified important water supply vulnerabilities. And I'll touch on those key issues in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So the first of those key findings is shown here on this chart, and it's regarding temperature. So the study projected that by the end of the century, temperatures will increase somewhere in the range of 5 to 6 degrees. And with the more significant impacts being in the upper watershed, as seen here on this map, that will be the darker portions of the map. Next slide, please. So the next key finding was as a result of the projected increase in temperatures. So as a result of that, runoff is projected to increase during the winter months. So here on this chart, as you can see at the top of the chart, it's showing historical data. And historically, the midpoint for runoff has been right around March in that time frame. It's showing here that by mid of the century, those are the circles in the middle of the chart. That midpoint for runoff is going to shift by about a month. It's going to move about a month earlier. And then by the end of the century, there's a lower portion of the chart. It's going to be even much more earlier in the year. So it could be somewhere around the January timeframe. So what this implies is it will put a lot of stress on surface reservoirs. And the study projected that there'll be a lot more flood releases from the Folsom Reservoir during the flood season. Also, the earlier runoff will mean that there will be a reduced water supply available during the summer and the fall periods. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary of what I just discussed. By the turn of the century, temperatures will increase by about 5 to 6 degrees. It will mean there'll be less snowfall, precipitation will occur more as rain. There'll be increased flood risks because of the increased release of flood waters. The hotter temperatures will mean longer summers. Longer and hotter summers will mean increased water demands, and during the summer and fall months, there will be reduced water available for summer and fall municipal and industrial use and other uses. So what does all of this mean for Roseville? So what the water utility has done is we've adapted our long-term infrastructure planning strategy, understanding that infrastructure that was built to address 20th century climate conditions won't necessarily provide the reliability we need for our water supply. So we've had to evolve in our planning, and we are working to build infrastructure for a 21st century climate reality. So over the next few slides, I'll walk through some of the strategies that we've been working on to both diversify our water supplies, but also to provide reliable access to already existing water supplies. Next slide, please. So the first of those strategies that I'll cover is regarding how Roseville is leveraging groundwater to help adapt to climate change impacts. And as Sean mentioned earlier in the presentation, Aquifer Storage and Recovery Program, or the ASR program, is continuing to expand. He mentioned we're currently constructing 2 wells, and then thereafter in the 2025 to 2028 timeframe, we'll add 2 additional wells. So these will serve as really a critical piece in our overall strategy. One of the primary reasons being because of the increased flood releases that are projected to happen in the future, the ASR well infrastructure will provide Roseville with the ability to receive excess flood waters that are being released from the Folsom Reservoir, inject that water into the aquifer, and then during drought periods or dry periods, when our surface water supplies are reduced, we can extract this water to supplement surface water supplies. Next slide, please. The next strategy we've been working on is to increase surface water access. So we're working with PCWA, Placer County Water Agency, on a few joint projects. Some of those are short-term efforts and others are much longer-term efforts. So for the immediate term, we're looking to increase operational flexibility and reliability at existing water interties between Roseville and PCWA. So on this chart, I've shown a couple of those interties where we've been doing some work. So jointly, we're working with PCW on a project at the 5-star intertie I've shown on the bottom of your screen, which includes improvements to equipment at that site. The equipment is nearing the end of useful life, so we're upgrading the equipment. And also we'll be adding system automation to that site to provide more operational flexibility for that intertie. And then at the Tinker intertie, which is on the upper portion of the screen, last year we conducted some engineering studies, gathering data that we've used to establish operational protocols that will guide how we adjust and operate both our systems to allow for increased water delivery through that intertie if needed in an extended dry period or during a drought situation. Next slide, please. The second effort we are working on with PCWA is a much longer term effort. It entails developing alternate conveyance infrastructure to allow us to access directly from PCWA our Middle Fork project water supply that Sean mentioned earlier. So currently those supplies can only be delivered to Roseville by wheeling it through the Folsom Reservoir through a single intake point there at the reservoir. So developing an alternate access point that is upstream of Folsom helps provide the infrastructure redundancy we need. So this will essentially help reduce the risk that is associated with depending on a single intake structure that has no redundancy at the Folsom Reservoir. So in the event that we run into a multi-year drought and experience a dead pool situation at Folsom, we would have an alternate mechanism to access water supplies from PCWA. So we're developing a 4-phase project, raw water pipeline project, that would essentially connect PCWA's Foothill Water Treatment Plant to Roseville's treatment plant. This is a joint project with the Army Corps of Engineers as a federal sponsor. We currently have an initial $75,000 federal appropriation to pay for initial Army Corps staff time. And we've also received a $21 million congressional authorization through the Water Resources Development Act bill through Senator Padilla's efforts. So for this federal fiscal year, we submitted an initial congressional appropriation request for $5 million to kick off this project. Currently, Roseville and PCWA staff are working with the Army Corps on a project partnership agreement. We hope to have that in place in the next few months, and then we'll kick off this project shortly thereafter. Next slide, please. The next effort we're working on with PCWA, essentially we're coordinating regarding diversifying our water supply portfolio with regards to a potential future opportunity for supplemental treated water from PCWA that we can access during extreme drought periods. So this will require purchasing capacity in a future phase of PCWA's Ophir water treatment plant. And as part of that project, it will require building conveyance infrastructure that would deliver treated water from the Ophir water treatment plant to Roseville. So we're currently conducting some preliminary evaluation for the project alignment, and we should have some results back early next year. Next slide, please. Finally, we are working with the City of Folsom, San Juan Water District, in coordination with the Bureau of Reclamation, exploring what options might be available to us in the vicinity of the Folsom Dam to install redundant intake facilities that will help mitigate against the impacts of a dead pool situation if that were to occur. So we're currently conducting technical studies to evaluate various options. At the conclusion of that study, we'll evaluate next steps to determine what viable options may be available that we can pursue further with the Bureau of Reclamation. And that wraps up our presentation for tonight. So we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Sean, Bobby, and George for that presentation. And we have a lot of questions and we have some time to get through all these. So I'm just going to go right through them and just call on certain folks based on what we see. The first question has to do with like regulations, excess water with regard to what we've seen with rain and snowpack, and then water banking. One of the questions was, during the winter when the Bureau was releasing water into the San Francisco Bay, why were we on water rationing? And then why couldn't we use excess water to build up our local aquifer? Sean, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. So typically what we do in terms of just understanding year by year where we stand relative to our Central Valley Project water supply is it really is all based on timing. So I'll just rewind back to this past year. So we actually get our initial allocation starting in February with the Bureau of Reclamation. That initial allocation wasn't 100% of supply because they really, although we saw significant storms coming through, significant amount of water coming through, the season wasn't quite done yet. They then provided another allocation announcement in March, and then subsequently in April, they finally came to the conclusion that they can provide 100% of CVP supplies to contractors for folks that are in municipalities. That happened in April, roughly about, if I recall correctly, about mid-April. So with respect to why we still had a drought stage in place, is number one, we have to figure out if we have sufficient water supplies based on actual official allocation news from the Bureau of Reclamation. Secondly, what we did is based on that 100% allocation, we looked at what existing regulations were in place. So the city was poised essentially to go back to a basic stage, which is remove a drought stage pretty closely after we got that initial allocation. But here's one little wrinkle in that plan. So what still existed and was in place was regulations from the State Water Resources Control Board. And essentially what that regulation required us to do was to maintain a stage 2 drought based on those regulations. Now, based on water conditions, State Water Board certainly could have made a decision based on current hydrological conditions that anybody can go out and probably figure out by that point in time. But rather than actually rescinding those regulations, they decided to go ahead and let those regulations stay in place until that expiration date of those regulations, which was in June. So at that point, once those regulations expired, the city then went back to a basic stage. So it was all about a matter of timing coupled with state mandates that the city's required to follow. We really didn't have a lot of choice in the matter. So that's really why you saw a bit of a delay. It came down to those mandates that were still in place and didn't allow the the city to make sort of a local decision with respect to what drought stage we want or not want. So.
Thanks, Sean. The next set of questions has to do with aquifer storage and recovery. Some of the questions that we had, and I'll turn it to George and or Sean. First and foremost, how much water can the 7 ASR wells provide? And the second question, and there's a couple more, but these two questions, how does the water get into the ASR or get into the ground?
George, you want to take that one or you want me to?
Yeah, I'll start and I'll pick it up and then you can chime in. The 7 ASR wells combined will produce somewhere around 8,000 gallons per minute. Each well has a different capacity. I'll say from a low of about 1,400 GPM to the larger capacity wells will do about 2,500 or 3,000 GPM, somewhere in that range. And so combined, it's about 8,000 GPM approximately. And then with extraction, basically, with injection, sorry, the rule of thumb is it's about half of what we extract. So those are kind of the ballpark estimates, and we can get exact numbers over again.
And then George and Sean, how much water has Roseville banked in the aquifer so far, or even just talk about this year maybe?
Yeah, so this year, from January to I think May was the last month where we banked. We banked right around 1,900 acre feet, something like that, in that range. And just for context for our listeners, so 1,900 acre feet will be water that will be able to provide about 6,000 single-family homes supply for a year. So that's about the quantity that we banked in this year.
I kind of skipped over it, but how does water get into the groundwater well? We use the same well, just in reverse order, right? So instead of pumping it out of the ground and delivering it to homes and businesses, we take that same piping infrastructure, reverse the flow, and it's able to go down into the aquifer.
That's right.
And then I don't know if you can answer this question, going back to ASR again, has there been any rebound in groundwater levels after the recent wet weather? And do we know by how much? I don't know if we can quantify that just yet.
I can try to address that. I know by virtue of the Groundwater Sustainability Agency that is in West Placer County. So we being sort of the county and other partners, including Roseville, there is a series of groundwater monitoring wells that are out there that really can assess, what the impacts in terms of just plain in-lieu recharge plus any direct recharge activities, how that actually affects groundwater levels. The last assessment that I saw seemed to indicate that that we were seeing some groundwater levels in some areas rising and some that were more sort of static in nature. But of course, it's safe to say, absent any, groundwater pumping during a wet year, which typically isn't a normal set of operations, you will see groundwater wells or groundwater aquifers actually naturally recharge over time. So I think what we're initially seeing is, yes, the significant amount of rainfall has had a positive impact. And I think we'll see how that kind of plays out over time.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. All right, some of the next batch of questions has to do with water efficiency, water usage, and population growth. So Bobby, you thought you were going to be off the hook, but you're not, man. So we have a couple of questions. One of the questions was indoor water use has to be reduced by 20% by 2030 compared to 2020, but our population is growing. How are we going to get to the 42 GPCD by 2030? Can you talk through maybe some of the strategies from a water efficiency standpoint? And in that answer, you can also talk about incentives and rebates that we offer as well.
Okay, so I think I'll start with this. If the regulation stays the way they are, it may be difficult for not only Roseville, but most agencies to meet their final budgets. Fortunately, the 42 GPCD is only the toilet or the indoor use portion of the legislation. So I did mention earlier that it is an aggregate of all four. So if the regulation stays the same, and if you're doing your best indoors, like low flow shower heads and low flush toilets, then we're going to have to focus a lot of efforts in the areas where really that use a lot of water, like your outdoor use. So currently, there's about 62 to 65% of your total water use in the summer is in your outdoor landscape. So because it is an aggregate, if we can do a huge effort in some of the other areas that we can control a little bit better to help us with that one indoor use standard, because come 2030, that's going to be a difficult one to achieve. But again, it's an aggregate. Now, Maurice, talking to the other part of this, where some of the incentives we have, our rebates have been really popular. Last year, the city of Roseville ran out of funding because people are using the Cash for Grass, which is our most popular program. We do still have some funding available, so I would strongly recommend people applying for a rebate. We also have what we call a waterwise house call. And so if you're looking for areas to try to reduce some of your indoor and outdoor use, call us. We'll come over and we'll be able to take a look at your household, where you're using water. We'll take a look at your irrigation controller. And, there's, for the most part, and what my experience has been, people probably use 20 to 30% more water in their landscape that their landscape actually needs. So we have some experts on board that can help you through that.
That's awesome. Thank you, Bobby, for that. And maybe, Sean, if you want to touch on this, there's a lot of discussion about how our community continues to thrive, economic prosperity, and balancing economic prosperity against water supply. So when we think about land use, when we think about both projects happening inside the city and even outside the city, in Placer County, for example, like, what are we doing to ensure water reliability in the face of economic prosperity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in terms of just new development that's occurring within Roseville, I think it's just really important to state that the water, in order for planned development to occur, water supplies actually need to be secured before those developments are actually approved to move forward. So the development areas that folks are seeing being currently constructed or built, those water supplies were actually secured, in those specific developments in many cases were approved many, many years ago. So with respect to each of those areas that are currently being developed, there is water supplies that are attached to those projects, and that's part of the overarching water portfolio that we talked a little bit about in terms of the various surface water supplies that we have available. So in that case, it's covered in that respect. I'd also just say, that there's also other influences in terms of water needs and changes in terms of land use. And I'll just say, the state's housing policy has had a significant impact, not only in Roseville, but in other cities. And really that housing policy is focused in on developing sufficient housing, mostly affordable housing. It's a statewide mandate. There are targets that the city has to meet, as well as other cities in California. And with that, you need to make sure that you have sufficient water supplies to meet those needs. And so one of the things that we really worked on in earnest this past year was securing options for additional water supplies from Placer County Water Agency to meet those infill needs. So if we're looking at mandated affordable housing that needs to occur in infill areas in the city that will have sufficient water supply to meet those needs as well. So Maurice, just to sum it up, all the water supplies have been secured for both development occurring in the newer areas as well as infill areas. And so we're in pretty good shape here in the city of Roseville with respect to water supply.
And then Bobby, maybe touch upon, like, we talk about rebates, we talk about water-wise house calls, and just other tools in our toolbox to help reduce water usage. Can you talk about a little bit about what we're doing on the commercial side related to WELO? And then just generally, what other types of water conservation should people consider as they're looking at simple ways to conserve at the household level?
So on the commercial side, we also offer a evaluation of the site, which is both indoor and outdoor. But most commercial sites take more advantage of our landscape outdoor evaluation, which is where our team will actually go out and turn on the commercial controllers and go through every zone and map out where the areas that need a lot of attention. We also identify a lot of leaks that way. In terms of the water efficient landscape ordinance, or WELO, which is actually a good thing. A lot of the properties that are being built now, there's certain requirements that they have to abide by in order to pass or get checked off on WELO, like smaller lawn areas and weather-based irrigation controllers, water efficient nozzles. So that is what's helping actually, with our water reduction, because homes that are being built today are required to keep water efficiency in mind. And I'm sorry, Maurice, was there something else that?
Yeah, just one other thing. If you, as a water conservation administrator, if you were to tell someone at the household level, what are some of the things that they can do right now to reduce water use, what would you say?
What I would say is, and as I mentioned earlier, irrigation landscape is the area that really utilizes most of the water. There's a lot that we can do in that arena, but not everybody are water nerds like we are here in water efficiency. So we have experts, we have certified experts that understand plants, they understand soil, the soil science. We also have for those that are considering maybe removing their lawns, because their lawns are a pretty high water use species plant, that we have the inspiration garden where they can actually go and look at what a garden would look like if they wanted to transition from overhead sprays to drip irrigation, because drip irrigation is where you're going to probably get the biggest bang for your buck. But there at the Inspiration Garden, we have low and medium water use plants, and we also have some native plants in there as well. And so people can actually see what a garden, and it's not a real big garden, but they can see what their home landscape can potentially look like if they go and visit our garden. But I highly recommend calling for a water-wise house call, and we can even offer more tips. And we also will give you a moisture meter so you can check your own soil.
So call Bobby.
No, don't call me.
We're going to shift gears a little bit to talk about additional surface water resources. And also we had a question related to recycled water. So both for Sean and George, can you talk about, our involvement in sites, what that would mean for the operation of Folsom Lake ultimately? And then questions surrounding Folsom and Deadpool, like what are we doing to reduce our reliance on Folsom in the event that there is dry, drought, or deadpool conditions?
Okay, I can take the first one, and maybe I'll have George cover the other question regarding what we're doing relative to climate change. So with respect to Sites Reservoir, in 2017, the city council decided to go ahead and join the Sites Reservoir Joint Powers Authority. So folks don't know what Sites Reservoir is. Pretty well known, but maybe folks may not really know what it is. It's a proposed off-stream reservoir that's located near the town of Maxwell. It's actually northwest of the city of Roseville. And essentially, the reservoir would be able to capture mostly rain-fed flows from the Sacramento River and actually be able to store water during those wetter times of year. And then when you get into drier periods of time, that water should be able to be used for the uses of the various partners. So back in 2017, the city of Roseville had an interest in joining that Joint Powers Authority. It wasn't so much to be able to access water from the reservoir, but most importantly, what we were looking at doing was answering this question. And that is, if a Sites Reservoir is constructed, is there a way to optimize operations at Sites Reservoir to be able to provide some additional water supply benefit to Folsom Reservoir? And the reason we ask that question is oftentimes because Folsom Reservoir is part of an integrated system with Shasta Reservoir and other reservoirs in the CVP system. When there's conditions that aren't great in the Bay Delta, they have salinity issues, things like that, they often lean on Folsom Reservoir as a way to flush water down the American River into the Sacramento River and then ultimately into the Bay Delta to push back that salinity that's coming in as a result of dry conditions. And the reason of it is it's merely because it's a matter of geography. Folsom Reservoir is much closer to the Bay Delta. Shasta is much further away, and that water that's needed, oftentimes it's a matter of expediency and being able to send that water that state and federal folks feel is needed to flush the salinity out of the Delta. So what we were really wanting to do out of participating in Sites Reservoir and supporting the project is, how can we optimize operations where instead of state and federal agencies leaning so hard on Folsom Reservoir, well, why not actually leverage some of that water from Sites Reservoir to meet the needs that are ultimately needed in the Sacramento River and most specifically the Bay Delta. So again, we weren't in it for, or not in it for additional water supply. It's more about providing additional benefit to Folsom Reservoir in terms of lake level and keeping that lake level as high as we possibly can. So we currently are continuing to be in the Joint Powers Authority. We've been very active supporting the project, advocating both at the state and federal level. And so the city council values Sites Reservoir as just another opportunity to expand surface water storage here in California.
Then George, related to Folsom Deadpool, one of the questions was what options are being considered to address it, but also in that there were other questions related to forecast informed reservoir operations, which probably tie back to this whole notion of Folsom going dry. Do you want to answer, provide a perspective there?
Yeah, so thanks, Maurice. So we're taking kind of a multi-approach to that. So I talked about some of those, and I'll kind of reiterate and tie it together. So we're looking at looking at solutions, working with the Bureau of Reclamation, City of Folsom, and someone to figure out what alternate infrastructure can be built, installed to address a deadpool situation. So currently we are maybe 90% through some of those technical studies, and we've looked at everything from barges, floating a barge, to doing pump stations on downstream of the reservoir, on the north side of the river, on the south side of the river, and a whole hybrid of all of those. So we're still looking at those options, and essentially what those will do is the goal is that essentially the option that we're able to agree on with the Bureau of Reclamation will help provide the redundancy we need. So if we were to get to a deadpool situation, we will activate whatever it is, whether it's a pump station on the Lower American River, whether it's a barge, to provide a supplemental water to support Roseville. However, we're also working on two other efforts to address the deadfall situation. And one of those is the raw water pipeline that I described. And so what that would do is, if for some reason we had a deadfall situation at Folsom and we couldn't access full allocation from Folsom, the raw water pipeline allows us to access our supplies, middle of project water supplies directly from PCWA to Roseville's water treatment plant, treat it at that plant, and then deliver it to our customers. So that's one of the options we're looking at. It's a significant project. It's approximately a 14-mile pipeline project with a pump station kind of midway. So it's a significant effort, but we are going through right now and establishing some of the preliminary agreements that we need to set up with the Army Corps of Engineers. So that is another avenue we're looking at. And then the third avenue we're looking at is on the treated water side of things to provide additional redundancy if we were to run into a deadfall situation. And that was the treated water pipeline I talked about. So that will require purchasing additional capacity in a future phase of PCWA's Ophir water treatment plant and building conveyance infrastructure from that Ophir treatment plant to Roseville that we can access if we're to run into a deadfall situation at Folsom. We'll have an alternate treated water pipeline that will deliver water from PCWA to Roseville. So we're looking at all these three approaches, and I think the solution is some kind of a hybrid between all of these options.
Great. And then related to operations at Folsom, can you describe like what modeling is used for reservoir releases or flood risk based on backward-looking climate data?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. So so essentially, the operation of the reservoir is a partnership between the Bureau of Reclamation, which is focused in on mostly water supply considerations in the CVP system, Central Valley Project System. But they have to work in partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So in the beginning of the presentation, I had referenced that the primary authorization of the project way back in the 40s was essentially a flood control facility. And that still continues to be the case. So with respect to how they operate the reservoir, so in the context of these wet years and how they release water. So if you go back probably about 5, 6, 7 years, and then all the way way back in the day when the reservoir started to be operable, the operators at Folsom Reservoir were operating essentially off a flood control book, if you will, that essentially had sort of this hard sort of line that shows that during what points in year you have to actually have vacated space available to be able to accommodate all the flows that would potentially come down from the American River into the reservoir. And a lot of that was really calculated based upon sort of historically how the reservoir fills up on an average basis. So those were pretty, somewhat complex for the time, but not as complex as we would probably like to see today. Fast forward, roughly about 5, 6 years ago, the Bureau of Reclamation, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, actually updated their flood control manual to make it a little bit more flexible with respect to how they operate the reservoir, being a little bit more dynamic. And I will say, and I spent a lot of time sitting in meetings with operations staff from Reclamation in terms of telling us what's going on with the reservoir. They are incorporating weather data, climate data, to be able to make more strategic decisions with respect to when and how they release water. And then conversely, they are very much looking into how they can get kind of balance out the needs of flood control, but also try to maximize the amount of water that they can actually conserve in the reservoir. And I will say that the Bureau of Reclamation, and in my time, I think is kudos to them, because I think that they've really, over the course of time, have really advanced their approach to how the reservoir is operated. And I would just say from a Roseville perspective, we certainly see the way that the reservoir has been operated over the past 3 or 4 years has significantly improved. We see a lot of effort by reclamation staff to try to conserve as much water as they possibly can, but also trying to finally balance, the other needs that are kind of put upon the reservoir. But I would say from our perspective, at least from a staff perspective, we really do appreciate the efforts that reclamation staff are doing to maximize the conservation of water so that we can have that water for the remainder of the water year.
Thank you for that. That's great. One final question has to do with recycled water. So as part of the City of Roseville's water portfolio, we do have recycled water that we use for irrigation purposes primarily. And it's highly treated wastewater. One of the questions that someone asked was, are there any plans to supply recycled water to existing water users for landscaping? So I'm assuming that it has to do with residential recycled water usage.
Yeah, I can try to address that. I would just say, currently the way we see recycled water, and I think this is just a continuity in terms of how it kind of operates in the context of new development within the city. I would say that obviously we're going to continue to offer recycled water in those newly developed areas. And the reason why we do that is because you're actually constructing pipelines, you're constructing infrastructure in areas that aren't developed yet, and it makes sense from just a sort of a cost efficiency perspective. Also, keep in mind that infrastructure is actually funded by the developers that are developing that infrastructure via connection fees that they provide for homes that are being built. Now, on the question of whether the city's going to be plumbing recycled water to sort of the older core portions of Roseville or into East Roseville, at this point in time, we don't have any plans to do that. And the reason being is that it would be somewhat cost prohibitive for us to do that, very expensive. You're digging up existing roads, you're actually having to put that infrastructure in, you're competing with other infrastructure on the ground. It could be extremely expensive to do that. And the way that would have to be paid for would be actually through utility rates, and that would actually be borne by customers that are living in the city at this point in time. So we don't really think it's the value of recycled water in that context is, at this point in time, it doesn't make sense for us to plumb into older parts of Roseville at this point. Now, that may change in the future as the future changes. But as we talked about, we're employing other strategies to ensure that we always have a reliable water supply in Roseville. And so we think there's other ways to go about that are much more cost efficient and friendly to our customers with respect to utility rates.
Thank you. All right, it looks like all the questions were asked going once. Are there any other questions that we might be able to answer for you tonight?
I think there was one question on there, Maurice, about best method to report water waste.
Yeah, and it's in the chat, but Bobby,
okay.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry if you addressed it already. I was just going to say, there is you can fill something out online that you can report anonymously, but the simplest way is just to call us at 774-5761, and we'd be happy to assist, and we love getting those calls.
Thank you, Bobby.
You're welcome.
There's one more question that came in regarding recycled water rates. When will recycled water rates equal potable rates?
So I can address that really quickly. So in terms of the developing the most recent rate case, the city has been slowly increasing the amount. So basically, it's indexed towards the potable rate, and so over time, sort of incrementally, we're working towards getting that up to that potable rate level. it will take probably several more years to get there, but that is certainly what we're trying to achieve through the current approved rate case that was approved by City Council recently. So we intend to continue down that route unless we get direction otherwise, but that's really the city's approach, is to eventually get there.
Thank you, Sean. So that rounds out all the questions that we've had from you all. Thank you all for participating. We had questions related to the American River Basin study. We posted that link in the chat, but we'll also post it on our website as well. In addition, this recording will be made available by sometime next week, as well as the presentation. So if there's not any other questions, we thank you again for your time and enjoy the rest of your evening.